There's nothing left to laugh about. The words echoed through the charred steel corridors, punctuated by the staccato hiss of failing oxygen systems. Commander Tess Varyn wiped soot from her face, her trembling hands smearing ash into the lines of her grief. The last stand of Outpost Kilo-7 was supposed to be their victory, a blaze of defiance against the relentless march of the Kralith Empire. But the thing about hope? It doesn't withstand 4,000 rounds per minute. If you're new here and love gripping sci-fi stories, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment below. Let's dive deeper into this universe together. Tess stumbled over the body of a comrade, her boots skidding in the blood-slicked floor. Somewhere in the distance, the last of the outpost turret systems screamed to life, spitting a futile cascade of plasma bolts into the black abyss beyond the breach. The Kralith were already inside, their laughter, a chilling, synthetic mimicry of human amusement, echoed through the halls, signaling the slaughter was far from over. She gritted her teeth, cradling the butt of her rifle, and surged forward. There had to be survivors. There had to be someone left to salvage what was once a proud colony. The Kralith invasion had begun as an anomaly, a single ship appearing at the edge of Terran space 2 years ago, its shimmering hull pulsating with eerie luminescence. They'd offered trade, laughter, and friendship. Within months, entire colonies were reduced to nothing but charred rubble. The Kralith didn't kill out of necessity. They killed out of amusement, their laughter growing louder with every pull of the trigger. Now! Tessa's home was the latest casualty. Her calm crackled to life, a garbled whisper fighting through static. Varyn, they've breached Sector 12. Rendezvous at. The voice cut off with a guttural scream, followed by that damned, mechanical laughter. Rage flared in her chest, hot and volatile. Tess had been a commander, a strategist, but strategy no longer mattered. This wasn't war. It was a massacre. As she approached the central command bay, she found herself surrounded by the remnants of her squad. Sergeant Keller leaned heavily against a shattered console, blood dripping from his temple, while Dr. Mara Ives frantically worked to stabilize a wounded engineer. "Commander," Keller rasped, his voice thick with pain. "We're down to our last magazine." Tess nodded, her gaze hardening. She wouldn't let them see her break. "Not here. Not now. Then we make them count." Dr. Ives looked up, her eyes wild. "We need to retreat. The Kralith are toying with us. You've seen what they do." "I've seen," Tess interrupted, her tone sharp. "And I'll be damned if I give them the satisfaction of running." The room fell silent, save for the distant clatter of approaching Kralith forces. Tess knew the truth as well as the others. There was no retreat. The outpost's only escape shuttles had been destroyed in the first wave. Whatever hope they had now rested in a desperate gamble. Overload the reactor core. Take the bastards with them. "Commander, you're not seriously," Keller began, but Tess silenced him with a look. "I am." She turned to the engineer, a young man whose face was pale with fear. "Can you rig the core to detonate?" He hesitated, then nodded. "It'll take time." "Buy it," Tess ordered, her voice cold steel. The squad moved into position, their battered weapons trained on the doors. The distant laughter grew louder, closer, filling the air with its mocking cadence. Tess took a deep breath, her hands steady as she gripped her rifle. Memories of laughter from another time, a warm, genuine kind, flashed through her mind. Her brother's jokes at family dinners, her squad's camaraderie during quiet moments between battles. All of it seemed like a lifetime ago. The Kralith had taken that from her. From all of them. The first wave of Kralith drones burst through the doorway, their spindly forms glinting in the dim emergency lighting. Tess fired without hesitation, her shots precise and fueled by fury. One by one, the drones crumpled, their laughter cutting off in sharp, static bursts. But for every drone she dropped, 3 more took its place. "Hold the line," she shouted, her voice carrying over the chaos. Dr. Ives screamed as a Kralith lunged toward her, its razor-sharp appendages slicing through the air. Keller intercepted it, with a wild swing of his rifle, knocking it off balance before Tess delivered the killing shot. "Commander, course primed," the engineer called out. Tess nodded, her mind racing. "Everyone fall back to the safe zone. Keller, set the charges to seal the corridor behind us." As the squad retreated, Tess took one last look at the command bay. It had been their home, their sanctuary. Now, it was a tomb. She turned and ran, the laughter of the Kralith echoing in her ears. The corridors groaned under the strain of the outpost's failing systems. Sparks rained down from exposed wiring, and the air carried a biting tang of ozone and burning metal. Tess led her squad through the labyrinth of hallways, her mind racing through every possible contingency. Behind them, Keller's charges detonated with a deafening roar, collapsing the corridor and slowing the advancing Kralith. For now, the engineer, Gavin, stumbled as he ran, clutching the control tablet tightly to his chest. "Commander, the reactor's timer is set, but the failsafe." "Forget the failsafe," Tess snapped. "How long do we have?" 7 minutes, maybe less." It wasn't enough time. Tess clenched her jaw as she motioned for the group to keep moving. Every instinct screamed at her to hurry, but she forced herself to keep pace with the others. Pushing too hard would only lead to mistakes, and mistakes meant death. Ahead, the central passage opened into a cavernous maintenance bay. The shadows loomed larger here, the flickering emergency lights creating an eerie strobe effect that made every movement seem like a phantom threat. The bay was supposed to house emergency vehicles, but all Tess saw were the charred husks of transport shuttles, their twisted frames a stark reminder of the Kralith's efficiency. "Check your corners," she ordered, her voice low but firm. The squad fanned out, their weapons raised. Keller took point, his battered frame moving with the precision of a seasoned soldier despite his injuries. Dr. Ives stayed close to Gavin, her medkit in one hand and a pistol she clearly hated using in the other. Tess moved to the center of the group, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of metal or the distant echo of that horrific laughter. "They're toying with us," Keller muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of his plasma rifle. "They want us to break," Tess replied. "Don't give them the satisfaction." A sudden clang echoed through the bay, drawing everyone's attention. Tess swung her rifle toward the sound, her finger hovering over the trigger. A shape darted through the shadows, too fast to track. "Contact, 12 o'clock," Keller barked, his rifle spitting a burst of plasma bolts. The shape vanished, but the sound of laughter filled the bay, louder than before. It was different this time, layered and distorted, as if the Kralith were mocking their fear. Tess felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "Commander," Gavin's voice was a trembling whisper. "They're jamming the sensors. I can't tell how many there are." "Doesn't matter," Tess said, her voice steely. "We hold here. Keep them off us until the reactor blows." The squad formed a defensive circle, their backs to each other as the laughter grew louder, echoing from every direction. Tess tightened her grip on her rifle, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then the first drone appeared. It dropped from the ceiling like a spider, its metallic limbs clattering as it landed in the center of the bay. Before anyone could react, it lunged at Keller, its serrated appendages slicing through the air. Keller sidestepped the attack and fired point-blank into its torso, the plasma bolt tearing through its core. The drone crumpled, but its laughter persisted, warped and disjointed, even as it fell silent. "Eyes up!" Tess shouted. More drones emerged, their spindly forms climbing down the walls and leaping from the shadows. The squad opened fire, the bay erupting into chaos. Plasma bolts lit up the darkness, their blue-white glow illuminating the swarm of Kralith drones. Tess moved with ruthless efficiency, her shots precise and deadly. She didn't have time to think, to feel, only to act. Each pull of the trigger was a calculated decision, each step a deliberate move to protect her squad. But the Kralith kept coming. Dr. Ives screamed as a drone lunged at her, its bladed limbs glinting in the flickering light. Tess fired, the shot narrowly missing the medic, but striking the drone square in the head. It collapsed, but another took its place almost instantly. "They're overwhelming us," Keller yelled, his voice strained. Tess knew he was right. For every drone they destroyed, 2 more seemed to emerge. The Kralith weren't just attacking, they were hurting them, pushing them closer to the center of the bay. "Fall back," Tess ordered. "Regroup near the south exit." The squad moved as one, their weapons blazing. Tess covered the rear, her heart pounding as she tried to keep the drones at bay. She could feel the weight of every second ticking away, the reactor's timer counting down to their final stand. As they reached the exit, Gavin stumbled, dropping the control tablet. A drone pounced, its claws slicing through the air toward his exposed back. Tess didn't think she acted. She lunged forward, tackling Gavin out of the drone's path and firing a shot into its head. The drone collapsed, its laughter cutting off abruptly, but not before its claws raked across her arm. Pain seared through her, hot and blinding, but she forced herself to her feet. "Go!" she shouted, shoving Gavin toward the exit. They burst into the corridor, Keller sealing the door behind them with a blast charge. The explosion shook the walls, but the laughter persisted, muffled but ever-present. Tess leaned against the wall, clutching her bleeding arm. Dr. Ives moved to help her, but Tess waved her off. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tight. "Just keep moving." The squad pressed on, the distant sound of the reactor core's countdown echoing in their ears. Tess didn't look back. The corridor sloped downward, plunging the squad into a deeper, darker part of the outpost. The emergency lighting was almost non-existent here, leaving only faint red beacons glowing dimly along the walls. Each step echoed unnervingly in the silence, amplifying the weight of the Kralith's pursuit. Gavin's hands trembled as he carried the control tablet, its cracked screen displaying the reactor countdown. For 27. Time was slipping through their fingers. "Commander," Dr. Ives said, her voice hushed but urgent, "you're bleeding too much. If we don't stop, we stop when this is over." Tess cut her off, her tone brooking no argument. "The Kralith won't care if I bleed out before or after they kill us all. Keep moving." The weight of her words pressed on the group like the stale air around them. Keller adjusted his rifle, sparing Tess a sidelong glance. "She's right. We got to push through. Any delays and we're all dead." "Comforting as always, Keller," Dr. Ives muttered, but she didn't press further. The hallway opened into what once had been the Outpost research wing. Desks and terminals lay overturned, shattered glass glittering on the floor. Holographic screens flickered sporadically, displaying fragments of corrupted data. A deep, unsettling chill seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. Tess slowed, her instincts kicking in. "Eyes up. This doesn't feel right." Keller nodded, taking the lead as his weapon scanned the room. No recent signs of movement. Either they haven't been here, or they're already watching, Gavin whispered, finishing the thought none of them wanted to voice. The faint sound of laughter reached them again, soft at first, like a distant wind. It grew louder with each step, the disjointed cackles rebounding off the walls in an unholy chorus. Tess tightened her grip on her rifle, her knuckles whitening. "Keep moving," she said, forcing the squad forward. Then the room erupted. The Kralith came from everywhere, dropping from the ceiling, crawling from hidden vents, and bursting through the walls. Their metallic limbs clattered against the ground as they swarmed toward the squad, their laughter a deafening roar. Tess fired instinctively, her shots ripping through the nearest drones. Keller followed suit, his plasma rifle spewing bolts that tore through the darkness. But for every drone they destroyed, more seemed to appear, their laughter growing louder, more mocking. "Gavin, where's the exit?" Tess shouted over the chaos. The engineer fumbled with his tablet, his panic making him clumsy. There's a maintenance hatch on the far side of the room. 50 meters. 50 meters might as well be 50 miles. Keller barked, slamming the butt of his rifle into an advancing drone before finishing it with a point-blank shot. "We'll make it," Tess growled, her voice cutting through the noise. "Move!" The squad broke into a run, weaving through the wreckage as the Kralith closed in around them. Tess covered the rear, her shots deliberate and unerring despite the pain in her arm. A drone lunged at her, its serrated limbs slicing through the air. She ducked, her shot obliterating its head. But another drone immediately took its place. Ahead, Gavin reached the maintenance hatch and began frantically entering commands into the control panel. "It's locked," he cried, his voice rising in panic. "Then unlock it," Keller snapped, firing wildly to keep the Kralith at bay. Tess and Dr. Ives reached the hatch, forming a defensive line as Gavin worked. Tessa's heart pounded as she fired again and again, her arms screaming in protest. The drones were relentless, their laughter a maddening cacophony that seemed to reverberate in her skull. Almost there, Gavin shouted, sweat dripping from his brow. "Not fast enough," Keller muttered, his rifle overheating. He tossed it aside, drawing a combat knife. "Cover me!" Before Tess could stop him, Keller charged forward, meeting the swarm head-on. His blade flashed in the dim light, cutting down one drone after another with savage precision. For a moment, it looked like he might hold them back. Then the Kralith overwhelmed him. "Keller!" Tess screamed as the drones swarmed him, their bladed limbs tearing into his armor. He fought to the last, his knife plunging into one final drone before he was pulled under. "Got it!" Gavin shouted as the hatches opened. "Move!" Tess ordered, dragging a stunned Dr. Ives through the opening. Gavin followed, and Tess slammed the hatch shut behind them. The sound of Keller's final scream was cut off as the seal engaged, leaving them in silence once more. Dr. Ives collapsed to her knees, her hands trembling. We left him. We didn't have a choice," Tess said, her voice hollow. But the words felt like ash in her mouth. Keller had been her second-in-command, her friend, and now he was gone. The corridor beyond the hatch was narrow and cramped, barely wide enough for them to move single file. Gavin glanced back at Tess, his face pale. "Commander, the timer, it's down to 2 minutes." Tess nodded, forcing herself to push the grief aside. "Then let's finish this. The reactor's blast radius will take out the Kralith, but we need to reach the shielded chamber to survive it." Dr. Ives looked up, her eyes filled with doubt. "And if we don't make it?" Tess didn't answer. The three of them pressed on, the distant laughter of the Kralith still echoing in their ears. Tess couldn't help but wonder how much of that laughter was real, and how much was inside her own mind. The tunnel was a claustrophobic gauntlet, the air thick with dust and the stench of burnt wiring. The glow of the reactor's dying core ahead cast eerie shadows that danced across the walls, making the confined space feel alive. Gavin clutched the tablet tightly, his breath shallow as he kept pace behind Tess. Dr. Ives followed, her movements mechanical, like she was holding herself together through sheer will. "Timer check," Tess barked, not slowing her pace. "Less than 90 seconds, Gavin replied, his voice cracking. "If we're not inside that shielded chamber when the core blows, we will be," Tess said, cutting him off. Her tone left no room for doubt, but her mind was racing with calculations. They were dangerously close to running out of time, and the Kralith weren't far behind. The corridor ended abruptly at a reinforced bulkhead, its surface scorched and dented from past battles. Tess skidded to a stop and motioned for Gavin to work the controls. "Get it open," she ordered. Gavin's hands flew across the panel, his fingers shaking as he bypassed the damaged circuits. "This isn't a standard lock. The Kralith must have corrupted the access codes." I need a minute." "We don't have a minute," Tess snapped, spinning to face the way they'd come. The faint, distorted laughter echoed down the tunnel, growing louder by the second. Tess felt her stomach twist as she raised her rifle, aiming into the darkness. They were coming. "I'm almost there," Gavin shouted, his voice frantic. Dr. Ives moved to stand beside Tess, her pistol trembling in her grip. "They won't stop, will they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Tess said, her eyes locked on the shadows. "They're not programmed to stop." The first drone emerged, its metallic body reflecting the reactor's sickly glow. Tess fired without hesitation, her plasma bolts slamming into its core. It crumpled to the ground, but more followed, dozens of them, their serrated limbs clattering as they surged forward. "Gavin!" Tess shouted, her voice strained as she fired shot after shot. "Almost there," he yelled, sweat pouring down his face. The Kralith closed in, their laughter a maddening cacophony that seemed to seep into Tess's bones. She gritted her teeth, refusing to give an inch. Each pull of the trigger was an act of defiance, a refusal to let these machines win. "Commander, I'm out," Dr. Ives cried, her pistol clicking empty. Tess tossed her a spare magazine without looking, her focus unyielding. "Keep shooting." The drones were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Tess felt a surge of panic as she realized they wouldn't be able to hold them off much longer. "Got it," Gavin shouted as the bulkhead groaned and began to slide open. "Move," Tess ordered, firing a final burst before retreating through the opening. Dr. Ives stumbled after her, and Gavin followed, slamming his fist against the emergency seal. The door hissed shut, the sound of the Kralith's laughter muffled but still audible. They stood in a small, shielded chamber, the walls lined with reinforced plating designed to withstand the reactor's detonation. The room was bathed in an eerie red light, the reactor's final countdown displayed on a cracked monitor. 0:23. Tess leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Dr. Ives sank to the floor, her hands trembling as she cradled her pistol. Gavin collapsed against the console, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Is this it?" Dr. Ives asked, her voice shaky. "Does the shield hold?" "It will," Gavin said, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. Tess didn't answer. She stared at the countdown, her mind racing. They had made it this far, but the cost had been staggering. Keller was gone. Half her squad was dead. And the Kralith, they weren't just machines. They were something more, something worse. The timer reached midnight. The explosion was deafening, even through the reinforced walls. The chamber shook violently, the lights flickering as the reactor's core unleashed its fury. Tess clenched her jaw, bracing herself against the wall as the shockwave rolled over them. Then silence. For a moment, none of them moved. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the survivors. Tess finally pushed herself upright, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Report," she said, her voice hoarse. Gavin checked the console, his hands shaking. The blast radius, it wiped out everything within 5 kilometers. The Kralith drones. He swallowed hard. "They're gone." Dr. Ives let out a shaky laugh, the sound tinged with hysteria. "We did it. We actually did it." Tess didn't share her relief. She stepped to the console, her eyes scanning the readouts. The Kralith were gone for now, but she knew better than to believe it was over. "They'll rebuild," she said, her voice low. "They always do." Dr. Ives looked up at her, confusion and fear in her eyes. "What are you saying?" "We destroyed their drones. We stopped them. For now," Tess said, turning to face her. "But the Kralith aren't just machines. They're a hive mind. Every drone we fought, every piece of code, they're all part of something bigger. Something we haven't even begun to understand." Gavin's face went pale. "You're saying they're still out there?" Tess nodded, her expression grim. This was just a battle. The war is far from over. The silence after the blast felt almost surreal, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Tess could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, each thud a reminder that she was still alive. For now, the reinforced chamber had held, but the sensation of safety felt thin, fragile, as if it could be ripped away at any second. Gavin slumped against the wall, the weight of the past hours catching up to him in a wave of exhaustion. "We're alive," he muttered, staring blankly at the floor. "Against all odds, we're alive." Dr. Ives, still sitting on the cold metal floor, hugged her knees to her chest. "But Keller," her voice cracked, and she didn't finish the thought. Tess didn't respond. She didn't have time for grief, not yet. Her mind was already racing ahead, calculating their next steps. Survival wasn't a victory. It was just a delay. She stepped toward the sealed chamber's access console, her hands steady despite the tremor of unease rippling through her. "Commander," Gavin said hesitantly, "shouldn't we, I don't know, rest for a minute? Recharge before we—" "There's no time," Tess said sharply. She didn't mean for it to come out so harsh, but the words hung in the air like a reprimand. "The Kralith aren't gone. We hurt them, yes, but it won't stop them for long. If we don't move, they'll regroup, and when they do, they'll be worse," Gavin finished, his tone grim. Dr. Ives wiped at her eyes, standing shakily. "How do you know?" That explosion wiped out everything above ground. It was enough to flatten their factory. What more could they have? Tess turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "The Kralith aren't limited to physical forms. You've seen how they adapt. Every drone we've fought, they're learning from us. Every attack we make teaches them something new. If we give them time, they'll come back stronger." Gavin looked at her sharply. "Stronger how?" "Smarter," Tess said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Tess turned back to the console, pulling up a schematic of the outpost. The reactor's explosion had decimated the upper levels, but there was still a deeper layer, a place that had been intentionally buried beneath the structure. "What is that?" Gavin asked, moving closer to peer at the screen. "The Outpost Black Site facility," Tess replied. "Classified research. The kind of thing no one talks about because it's too dangerous." Dr. Ives stepped forward, her brows furrowing. "You're saying there's another level below us? I didn't see anything about that in the blueprints." "You wouldn't," Tess said. "This isn't standard military data. Black site facilities are off the books, hidden even from most command structures. But I've seen this layout before. It's where they store experimental tech." "Tech," Gavin echoed, suspicion edging into his voice. Tess nodded. "Weapons. Prototypes. Things that were never meant to see the light of day. And if the Kralith got access to that," Dr. Ives paled, "they could reverse engineer it. Turn our own weapons against us." "Exactly," Tess said, her voice tight. She tapped the screen, highlighting an access point deeper into the outpost. "There's a lift shaft leading down. If we can get there before the Kralith, we might be able to destroy whatever's left." Gavin's hands curled into fists. "Or we'll just be walking into their trap. You think they don't know about that place? They're probably already down there, waiting for us. Then we take the fight to them," Tess said coldly. "It's better than waiting here for them to rebuild and come after us again." Dr. Ives let out a shaky breath, her eyes darting between the screen and Tess's face. "We've barely survived this long. How are we supposed to fight them in their own den?" Tess stared at her, her gaze unwavering. "Because we don't have a choice. If we don't stop them now, there won't be a next time." The resolve in her voice silenced any further arguments. Gavin exchanged a glance with Dr. Ives, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but if this goes sideways—" "It won't," Tess said, though her voice betrayed the shadow of doubt lingering in her mind. They gathered their gear, what little they had left, and prepared to descend. The shielded chamber had a secondary hatch leading to the lower levels, but it was sealed tightly, requiring manual overrides. Gavin worked at the controls, his brow furrowed in concentration. As they waited, the laughter returned. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like a distant whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second, echoing through the walls. Tess gritted her teeth, her fingers tightening around her rifle. "They're still alive," Dr. Ives whispered, her voice trembling. They never died, Tess corrected, her tone bitter. They just waited. Gavin cursed under his breath as sparks flew from the control panel. This hatch is ancient. The mechanisms are jammed. I'll need a few more minutes to override it. We don't have a few minutes, Tess said, her eyes scanning the room. Work faster. The sound of metal scraping against metal sent a chill down her spine. The Kralith were coming. The walls seemed to vibrate with their approach, their laughter a maddening symphony of chaos. Commander, Dr. Ives said, panic rising in her voice. They're here. Tess turned toward the noise, her rifle raised. Hold the line, she ordered. Gavin, get that hatch open no matter what. The Kralith burst through the far wall in a shower of sparks and debris, their serrated limbs gleaming in the dim light. Tess fired immediately, her plasma rounds cutting through the first wave. Dr. Ives joined her, the crack of her pistol adding to the cacophony. The drones were faster this time, more coordinated. They moved like a swarm, their movements almost organic as they advanced. Tess gritted her teeth, her shots precise but not enough to stem the tide. Gavin, she shouted. I'm working on it, he yelled back, his voice laced with frustration. One of the drones lunged at Dr. Ives, its bladed arms slashing toward her. She screamed, ducking just in time, but the drone's momentum carried it forward. Tess stepped in, slamming the butt of her rifle into its head before finishing it with a point-blank shot. Stay focused, Tess barked. The laughter grew louder, almost deafening. The Kralith weren't just attacking, they were taunting. Tess could feel the weight of their intelligence bearing down on her, an oppressive force that made her doubt her every move. Got it, Gavin shouted as the hatch finally groaned open. Go, Tess ordered, covering their retreat as the others scrambled through the opening. She fired a final burst before diving in after them, slamming the hatch shut behind her. The darkness of the lower level enveloped them, the air heavy with the stench of decay and machine oil. Tess's breathing was ragged, her body aching from the relentless combat. This is it, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos still echoing in her mind. No turning back now. The lower level was a labyrinth of shadows and decay, the air thick with the scent of corrosion and something darker, something alive. Tess activated her helmet's flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom to reveal walls covered in strange, jagged carvings. The markings were precise, mechanical, but the patterns twisted in ways that made Tess's stomach churn. What is all this? Gavin whispered, his voice barely audible. Dr. Ives crouched to examine the carvings, running her fingers over the cold metal surface. They're Kralith script, she said, her voice shaking. Or something like it. This isn't just an outpost for their drones. It's something else. A command center, maybe. A hub. Tess swept her rifle across the corridor, every nerve on edge. Keep moving. Whatever this place is, it's not safe. The team advanced cautiously, their footsteps echoing down the metal halls. The deeper they went, the more twisted the environment became. Wires hung from the ceiling like vines, some sparking with faint traces of electricity. Pools of oily liquid shimmered under their boots, reflecting the dim light in unsettling patterns. Dr. Ives stopped suddenly, her breath catching in her throat. Look at this. Tess turned, her flashlight illuminating what had caught Ives's attention. It was a drone, or what was left of one. The machine had been torn apart, its limbs scattered across the floor. But its core was intact, a pulsing, organic mass embedded in its metallic frame. It's still alive? Gavin asked, taking a hesitant step closer. Not alive, Dr. Ives said, leaning in for a better look. But something is growing inside it. Tess raised her rifle. Don't get too close. We don't know what it's capable of. Dr. Ives nodded, backing away, but her eyes lingered on the strange core. This isn't Kralith design. It's something else entirely. Something new. That's not reassuring, Gavin muttered. The team pressed on, the corridors becoming more claustrophobic with each step. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder and heavier. Tess's flashlight flickered, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement in the shadows. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice sharp. "See what?" Gavin asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Something moved," Tess said, scanning the corridor ahead. "Stay close. And keep your weapons ready." The laughter returned, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct, as if the Kralith were surrounding them. Tess's grip on her rifle tightened, her finger hovering over the trigger. "They're here," she said, her voice a low growl. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling disappearing into the darkness above. The walls were lined with rows of dormant drones, their lifeless eyes staring down like silent sentinels. At the center of the room was a massive machine, its design unlike anything Tess had ever seen. It pulsed with a faint blue light, its surface covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe as she watched. "What the hell is that?" Gavin asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Ives stepped forward, her eyes wide with awe and fear. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's their core," Tess said, her voice hard. "This is where it all starts. Their hive mind, their control network. It's all coming from here. And you think we can destroy it?" Gavin asked, his tone skeptical. "We have to," Tess said. "If we take this out, we cripple them. At least for a while." Dr. Ives hesitated, her gaze fixed on the machine. "But what if this is more than just a core? What if it's something we don't understand? Destroying it could save billions of lives," Tess interrupted. "We don't have the luxury of second-guessing this. We do it now, or we don't leave here at all." Before anyone could respond, the drones lining the walls came to life. Their eyes lit up in unison, a cold, piercing blue that bathed the room in an otherworldly glow. The laughter became deafening, a relentless chorus that seemed to emanate from the machine itself. "Move!" Tess shouted, firing at the nearest drones as they detached from the walls and descended upon them. The room erupted into chaos. Plasma bolts lit up the chamber, sparks flying as drones fell under Tess's relentless assault. Gavin took cover behind a console, his hands trembling as he struggled to fire his pistol. Dr. Ives crouched low, her face pale, as she tried to make sense of the situation. "Tess," Gavin shouted over the noise. "That thing in the center, it's got some kind of shield. Our weapons aren't doing anything to it." Tess gritted her teeth, her mind racing. The drones were coming faster now, their movements more coordinated. The hive mind was adapting, countering their every move. "There has to be a way to disable it," she said, firing another burst. "Look for a weakness." Gavin scrambled to the console, his fingers flying over the controls. "I'm trying, but this system, it's not like anything I've seen before. It's rewriting itself faster than I can keep up." Dr. Ives suddenly stood, her eyes wide with realization. "It's not just a machine," she said. "It's learning. It's evolving. Then we destroy it before it finishes," Tess said, her voice cold and determined. "Gavin, focus. Find me a way to overload it." "I'm working on it," he shouted, sweat pouring down his face as he fought against the system's defenses. Tess held her ground, her rifle overheating as she took down drone after drone. But they kept coming, their laughter echoing in her mind, taunting her, daring her to fail. Finally, Gavin shouted, "I've got it! There's a power conduit running through the floor. If we can sever it, we might be able to short-circuit the whole thing." Tess didn't hesitate. "Mark it." Gavin highlighted the conduit on his tablet, and Tess moved swiftly, dodging the drones as she made her way to the target. The floor beneath her glowed faintly, the conduit pulsating with energy. "This better work," she muttered, planting a charge on the conduit. As she armed the detonator, the laughter shifted, becoming more frantic, more desperate. The drones redoubled their efforts, swarming toward her like a tidal wave of metal and fury. "Tess, hurry," Gavin shouted, with a final burst of fire. Tess retreated, her finger hovering over the detonator. "Get clear," she shouted. The explosion ripped through the chamber, the shockwave knocking Tess off her feet. The drones collapsed mid-charge, their bodies clattering to the ground as the core's light flickered and died. Silence. Tess pushed herself up, her ears ringing. The chamber was dark now, the only light coming from the faint glow of her flashlight. She looked around, her heart pounding. "Is it over?" Dr. Ives asked, her voice trembling. Tess didn't answer. She stared at the remains of the core, her mind racing. They had won for now, but deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. The silence was deceptive, clinging to the air like a predator waiting to pounce. Tess stood in the wreckage of the chamber, her breathing shallow as her flashlight swept over the bodies of lifeless drones. Gavin and Dr. Ives emerged from behind the console, their faces pale and drawn, the terror of the last moments still etched in their eyes. "Did we really stop it?" Gavin's voice wavered, his words tinged with disbelief. Dr. Ives shook her head, her gaze fixed on the dormant core. "We severed its connection. But stop it? No. We've only delayed it. Whatever this is, it's not just a machine. It's a force." Tess didn't respond. She was focused on the subtle hum in the air, a sound too faint to be real, but too persistent to ignore. She could feel it, a tremor just below the edge of perception, like the rhythm of a heartbeat buried deep within the station. "We need to leave," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the lingering unease. "Whatever's left of this thing won't stay down for long." They retraced their steps, the corridors somehow feeling narrower and darker than before. The eerie carvings on the walls seemed to twist and shift as the flashlight passed over them, the patterns alive with a sinister energy. Gavin stumbled, his nerves fraying with each step. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Tess nodded. The laughter was back, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the drones. It was coming from the station itself, a haunting echo that seemed to grow stronger as they moved. "It's aware of us," Dr. Ives murmured, her voice trembling. The core wasn't just its brain, it was its voice. "We silenced it, but it's still here, watching us." "Then we keep moving," Tess said, gripping her rifle tightly. "No stopping, no second-guessing. We make it to the ship, and we blow this place sky-high." They reached the stairwell, the climb back to the surface feeling endless. Each step was a battle against the suffocating atmosphere, the oppressive weight of the station pressing down on them. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls and into their bones. "Almost there," Tess said, her voice strained. But as they reached the top, the air shifted. The shadows seemed to coalesce, thickening and writhing with a life of their own. The laughter swelled, a chorus of voices overlapping and intertwining until it became a single, deafening roar. "Run!" Tess shouted, shoving Gavin and Dr. Ives ahead of her. They bolted down the corridor, the shadows surging after them like a living tide. Tess fired blindly over her shoulder, the plasma bolts vanishing into the darkness. It wasn't enough. The station was alive, its wrath a tangible force closing in around them. They burst into the main hangar, the ship looming ahead like a beacon of salvation. Gavin stumbled, nearly falling, but Tess yanked him to his feet, her grip ironclad. "Go!" she screamed, firing at the darkness as it poured into the hangar. Dr. Ives reached the ship first, slamming her hand against the control panel to lower the ramp. Gavin followed, scrambling inside as Tess covered their retreat. The laughter was all around her now, the shadows pressing closer, suffocating her with their presence. "Tess, come on!" Gavin shouted from the ramp. With a final burst of speed, Tess sprinted for the ship, diving onto the ramp as the shadows surged forward. Dr. Ives hit the controls and the ramp began to rise, sealing them inside. The ship's engines roared to life, and they lifted off, the station shrinking beneath them as they climbed into the void. Tess collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. "Did we make it?" Gavin asked, his voice shaky. Tess didn't answer. She stared out the viewport. Her eyes locked on the station as it faded into the distance. The laughter had stopped, but the hum lingered, a reminder that the fight wasn't over. Dr. Ives sank into a chair, her face pale and drawn. "We need to report this," she said quietly. The Kralith weren't just building drones. They were building something far worse. Something we don't understand. Something we can't afford to let survive, Tess said, her voice cold and resolute. Gavin looked at her, his expression a mix of fear and determination. "You're talking about going back. After what we just saw." Tess nodded. "Not just us. We'll bring everything we've got. Every ship, every weapon. We end this before it spreads." Dr. Ives hesitated, her gaze distant. "And if it's already too late?" Tess didn't answer. She didn't need to. The hum in the air was all the answer she needed. The ship's console beeped, a warning light flashing. Tess leaned over, her eyes narrowing as she read the display. "What now?" Gavin asked, his voice tense. Tess's heart sank. "We've got a problem." The station wasn't fading into the distance. It was following them. The hum grew louder, filling the ship with its ominous presence. And then the laughter returned. The laughter echoed through the ship's hull like a relentless storm, reverberating in the metal walls, vibrating in Tess's bones. It was impossibly loud, a chorus of voices rising from every corner of the ship as though the station had somehow infected their vessel. Tess slammed her fist on the console, but the warnings persisted. Unfathomable signals that made no sense, a frequency that only seemed to grow stronger the farther they traveled. "Get to the weapons bay," Tess snapped, standing abruptly. Her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. "We need to be ready for anything." Gavin and Dr. Ives scrambled to follow her, their footsteps echoing in the hall as Tess moved with purpose. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The ship had always felt like home, a fortress in the vastness of space. Now, it felt like a tomb, its walls closing in with every passing second. "What the hell is going on?" Gavin demanded as he caught up to her. Tess didn't have the answers, not yet. But she knew one thing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't natural. The station was too far behind them for any conventional means of tracking. The laughter, it wasn't a glitch or an anomaly. It was alive. As they reached the weapons bay, Dr. Ives was already at the console, her fingers flying over the controls. "I can't make sense of the readings. The ship systems are being overridden." Tess cursed under her breath. "Is there any way to block it?" Dr. Ives hesitated, her face tight with frustration. "Not unless we sever the connection entirely. But we'd have to shut down all non-essential systems. And that would leave us vulnerable." "Vulnerable to what?" Gavin asked, his voice trembling. Tess didn't answer immediately. She turned to the viewport, her eyes scanning the stars. But her focus wasn't on the space outside. It was on the feeling creeping through her, a dread that sank deeper with every second. "It's not just in the ship," Tess said slowly. "It's in us, too." Gavin's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I think the station infected the ship systems," Tess explained, her voice low. "It's not just the laughter, it's the core, the machine. It wasn't just a weapon or a command center. It was a virus. And now it's inside us." Dr. Ives cursed under her breath. "You're saying that whatever that thing was, it's not just mechanical? It's biological," Tess finished. "Yes." A cold silence settled over the room, the weight of Tess's words hanging heavily in the air. Gavin swallowed hard. "So we're already infected?" Tess nodded grimly. "We won't know for sure until it's too late. But if we don't stop this, it won't just be the ship. It'll be everything. The whole damn galaxy." Dr. Ives's face went pale, her hands shaking as she continued to work at the console. "I need time. But the systems, everything is shifting. The signals aren't just coming from the station anymore. They're coming from all around us. Tessa's gut twisted. She knew exactly what that meant. The station had sent out its signal, and it was spreading. It wasn't just confined to the wreckage they'd left behind. It was reaching out, trying to infect anything it could. Where are the nearest ships? Tess demanded. Dr. Ives's eyes widened as she looked over the readings. There are several, on a course for the same sector. If they don't change trajectory soon, they'll be within range of the signal. Gavin's voice shook. So we're not the only ones. No, Tess said, her voice hard. And we can't afford to let it spread. We have to warn them. We have to stop it. But even as she spoke, the ship groaned a deep, mechanical sound that rattled the walls. A low, guttural growl of something unseen, something ancient. The lights flickered, and the laughter grew louder, impossibly loud. It was everywhere now, inside them, beneath their skin, in the very air they breathed. Tess slammed her fist against the console. Dr. Ives, figure out how to sever the connection. I'm going to find the source. Gavin, stay here and monitor the systems. If you see anything unusual, report it immediately. They nodded. But Tess didn't wait for confirmation. She turned and stormed out of the room, her mind racing with possibilities. They had to be fast. The station's influence was spreading, infecting every system it could touch. And if they didn't stop it, the galaxy would be plunged into chaos. She reached the main control room, her heart pounding in her chest. The hum of the ship's engines was almost unbearable now, a constant thrum beneath her feet. The laughter echoed off the walls, mocking her every step. Tess approached the central console, her fingers moving swiftly over the controls. The display in front of her flickered and shifted, images distorting as the ship's systems fought to regain control. Tess gritted her teeth. It wasn't just a virus. It was an invasion. She accessed the external sensors, but the feed was distorted, filled with static and static. Then a new image appeared, one that made her stomach drop. A ship, a massive dark vessel, just outside the range of their sensors. And it wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of ships, all headed for the same sector, all under the control of the station's influence. Tessa's blood ran cold. They weren't just infected. They were leading an army of ships, each one carrying the same horrors she had witnessed on the station. And they were coming for the galaxy. Tessa's mind raced, trying to piece together the enormity of what was unfolding before her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The station hadn't just been building drones or constructing weapons. It had been creating a network, a collective consciousness that stretched across the stars. Every ship, every machine, every person who came into contact with the signal was becoming part of it. Her fingers flew across the console, trying to reach the comm system, but the channels were flooded with static. The laughter surged once more, as though mocking her efforts. She could feel the station's presence creeping through the ship like an invasive, malevolent force. She wasn't just fighting to stop an invasion. She was fighting to keep her mind intact. Tess, Gavin's voice crackled over the intercom. What's happening out there? I'm not sure yet, Tess replied, her voice low. But it's worse than we thought. The station, whatever it is, has sent out a signal. It's controlling the ships in its path. We've got to stop it before it reaches the sector. She slammed her fist into the console, frustrated with the lack of control. The system was breaking down, the very core of the ship turning against her. She couldn't stay here much longer. Dr. Ives, are you anywhere near the core? Tess called out over the intercom. Working on it, Dr. Ives responded, her voice strained. I've isolated part of the signal, but it's changing. Every second it's evolving. It's not just a signal. It's alive. Tess closed her eyes for a moment, taking in a shaky breath. She knew the threat. They'd stopped the drones, but the real danger was far worse. The core wasn't just a weapon. It was a parasite, and it was spreading. Can you stop it? Tess asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. I don't know, Dr. Ives admitted, but we can't afford to wait. We need to act before it gets any worse. The ship's power grid is being compromised. We won't have much time before the systems go completely offline." Tessa's heart pounded. They were running out of options and fast. She couldn't wait for Dr. Ives to find a solution. They needed to take action now. "Gavin, I need you to prepare the ship for a jump," Tess ordered, her mind snapping into action. "We're not going to stop the signal from here, but if we can get far enough away from the station, we might be able to break its hold." "Understood," Gavin replied, his voice tight. But Tess wasn't so sure. Even if they could make the jump, how could they be sure the signal wouldn't follow them? How could they outrun something that had infected the very fabric of the galaxy? As she moved to the cockpit, Tess glanced at the stars outside. The vast, cold emptiness stretched out before her, a reminder that no matter how far they ran, they couldn't escape what had been unleashed. She slid into the pilot's seat, her hands trembling as she keyed in the coordinates for the nearest jump gate. She had to stay calm. They had to get out of here, but she couldn't help the sinking feeling in her gut. The laughter was louder now, filling every corner of her mind. It wasn't just the station, it was everywhere. The universe was unraveling, one system at a time. Tess exhaled sharply and engaged the engines, the hum of the ship's core vibrating beneath her as the jump gate came into view. "We're almost there," Tess said, trying to reassure herself as much as Gavin. But as they drew closer to the jump gate, the laughter grew deafening, a chaotic cacophony that threatened to drown out everything else. Tess gritted her teeth, her hands gripping the controls so tightly her knuckles went white. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the universe pressing down on her. And then, just as they reached the gate, the ship shuddered. A wave of heat flooded through the cockpit, followed by a sharp, jarring sound that rattled the entire vessel. Tessa's heart skipped a beat. "Brace for impact," she shouted, slamming her hand against the console. The ship lurched violently, throwing them off balance as the jump gate's energy fluctuated, its power flickering like a dying star. The ship's systems groaned and whined in protest, sparks flying from the control panel. Tessa's breath caught in her throat as the walls seemed to close in on her. The laughter now so intense it felt as though it was coming from inside her own skull. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The laughter, the hum, the sense of dread. It all vanished, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Tessa's pulse raced in her ears, and she struggled to steady her hands on the console. She glanced around the cockpit, but nothing seemed out of place. The ship was still intact, still functional. "What happened?" Gavin asked, his voice hushed. Tess didn't have an answer. She couldn't explain the sudden silence. She couldn't explain why the ship had stopped trembling, or why the laughter had faded into nothing. "Did we make it?" Dr. Ives's voice crackled over the comms. Tess hesitated before replying. I think so, but I don't know for how long." As she looked out into the darkness of space, Tess couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped. They had only delayed the inevitable. The galaxy had been touched by something far worse than they could ever imagine, and they had no idea just how far its influence stretched. Tess leaned back in her seat, trying to collect her thoughts as the stillness in the cockpit seemed to press down on her. Her fingers rested lightly on the console, the ship now eerily silent. The jump gate had spit them out into a sector far from the infected zone, but her heart still raced. The cold vacuum of space stretched out before her like an endless abyss, and for the first time in a long while, Tess didn't feel the familiar hum of security. Instead, there was an emptiness, an unsettling quiet that felt wrong. "Nothing," Gavin said, his voice strained. We're clear, right?" "I don't know," Tess replied, staring out into the void. The stars seemed distant now, cold pinpricks in an ocean of black. "We've outrun the station for now, but I can't shake the feeling we're not free. Whatever happened there, it's not over." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the soft hum of the ship's life support systems. Tess closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the past few hours crash over her. They'd barely escaped the station's grasp, but the deeper implications were settling in. The virus was no longer just a threat. It was a harbinger, and they were now its carriers. "What's the plan?" Gavin's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to face him. His face was pale, eyes shadowed with fear, but there was determination there too. "We can't keep running forever." Tess nodded, her mind already racing ahead. They had to regroup, find out who else had been infected, and find a way to stop this once and for all. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. There was no returning to the way things were. The galaxy, and everything they'd once known, had already begun to unravel. "We need to warn others," Tess said, her voice firm. "We can't let this thing spread any further. Dr. Ives, are you able to access any communication systems? We need to send a warning." Dr. Ives's voice crackled through the intercom. "I'm trying, Tess, but the comms are still scrambled. It's like we're being blocked. The signal, the infection, it's everywhere. The system is still compromised." Tess's blood ran cold. The enemy was already closer than they realized. The virus wasn't contained to just the ships. It had infected the very fabric of space communication. They couldn't even send a distress signal, couldn't reach out for help. They were on their own. Tess slammed her fist against the console in frustration. "This has to stop. If we don't find a way to sever this connection, it'll be the end of us all." But Dr. Ives's next word stopped her in her tracks. "Wait, Tess, you need to see this." The tone of her voice was more urgent than Tess had ever heard. She shot a quick glance at Gavin before bolting to the rear of the ship, where Dr. Ives was working. The scientist was hunched over a terminal, her hands flying over the keys. The image on the screen shifted rapidly, the data scrolling past too quickly for Tess to process. "Look at this," Dr. Ives said, her voice tight. The station wasn't just broadcasting a signal. It was amplifying itself. It's not just a machine, it's growing. The entire infrastructure is adapting, evolving. Tess leaned closer, her eyes scanning the data. The numbers were almost incomprehensible, a pattern of signals that shifted in real time. But there was something else there. A map, a network of ships and stations, all interconnected, their paths converging in the same sector. "What am I looking at?" Tess asked, a knot forming in her stomach. "The core," Dr. Ives said, pointing to the screen. "It's still active, and it's expanding. The signal's not just contained to the station. It's spreading through the network of ships like a virus replicating itself. It's building." Tess's heart skipped a beat as the pieces began to fall into place. The station hadn't been a one-off experiment. It had been a prototype, a beginning. What they had seen was just the tip of the iceberg. This was a deliberate, calculated invasion, an intergalactic infection that would grow stronger with every ship it touched. "So, what do we do?" Gavin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to destroy it," Tess said, the weight of her decision settling over her like a stone. "If we don't, it will spread to the entire galaxy. We have to go back to the station." There was a moment of stunned silence. Gavin and Dr. Ives exchanged a look, neither of them voicing their doubts, but they were there in their eyes. They'd barely made it out alive the first time. Going back meant facing what they had already survived and risking everything. "You're asking us to go back to the heart of the infection." Gavin's voice was tinged with disbelief. "Yes," Tess said, her tone unwavering. "If we destroy the core, we can stop it before it's too late. We can't wait for it to grow. We don't have a choice." They stood there, locked in a tense silence. The weight of Tess's words hung in the air like a challenge. There was no going back after this. No easy solutions. But they had one chance to stop the madness. "We'll need a plan," Dr. Ives said quietly. Tess nodded. "We'll figure it out. We've done it before." The decision was made, but the consequences of it were only beginning to sink in. Tess stood in the quiet of the ship, staring at the distant stars outside, trying to collect her thoughts. They were going back to the heart of the infection, the source of the madness that had nearly torn them apart. But deep down, she knew that even with all their preparations, there was no guarantee they'd make it out alive. "How do we even get close to the station again?" Gavin asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "If the signal's still broadcasting, we'll be right back where we started, with no way to escape." Tess shook her head, her mind already working through the possibilities. "We'll need to mask our signature. If we can't get past their radar, we'll never get close enough to destroy the core. Dr. Ives, can you help us with that?" Dr. Ives looked up from the terminal, where she had been analyzing the data. "I can try, but I'll need access to the station system, or at least something similar. It's not just about turning off the signal. It's about redirecting it. If I can reroute their transmissions, we might be able to hide our approach." Tess nodded. "Then we'll make that work. But we'll need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the more ships will fall under its control." With the plan in motion, Tess felt a new sense of urgency take over. This was no longer about survival. It was about stopping a contagion before it reached its full potential, before it infected every corner of the galaxy. And that meant they had to act fast. "We'll need a distraction," Gavin said, pacing in the small cockpit. "If we want to get close enough without being detected, we'll need something to draw their attention away." Tess thought for a moment. The station had been heavily fortified, its defenses practically impenetrable, but there were always weak spots. Every system had its vulnerabilities. The trick was finding it before they were found. "I'll take care of that," Tess said, determination in her voice. "I know the station's layout. I can pinpoint the blind spots. We'll slip in, get to the core, and disable it before they even know we're there." The team fell into a quiet rhythm as they prepared for their dangerous mission. Tessa's mind raced, running through every scenario, every potential outcome. She could feel the weight of the mission bearing down on her. Failure was not an option. If they didn't succeed, the galaxy would fall. It was as simple as that. Gavin and Dr. Ives worked together on the ship systems, fine-tuning their cloaking mechanism. Tess moved into the weapons bay, double-checking their gear. She had to be ready for anything. The station wasn't just a fortress. It was a nest, a breeding ground for whatever horror had taken root. As they approached the station's sector, the familiar dread began to creep back into Tessa's bones. The laughter, distant at first, was now an omnipresent hum that filled the air, a low, unsettling noise that seemed to wrap around her, pulling her deeper into the madness. "Are you sure about this?" Gavin asked, his voice a whisper as they neared the station. Tess glanced at him, her expression hardening. "We don't have a choice." The ship's cloaking system hummed as it activated, rendering them invisible to the station's sensors. They were in, but it wouldn't be long before the station detected them. Every second they spent inside its reach was another step closer to their discovery. Almost there, Tess muttered to herself, her hands gripping the controls. Her mind was sharp, but her body felt heavy. She pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. They could not afford to fail. The station loomed ahead, its enormous structure bathed in the pale light of distant stars. The sickening feeling in Tessa's chest tightened, but she didn't have time for fear. She had one chance to make it count. As they drifted closer, the eerie silence between the team grew, each of them knowing the stakes. There was no turning back. Once they entered the heart of the station, there would be no escape until the mission was complete. And even then, the future was uncertain. The galaxy they once knew could be forever changed. "We're in," Dr. Ives said, her voice tinged with relief. "Now we need to find the core." The ship's systems began to flicker as they passed through the station's outer defenses, the signal growing stronger, its laughter louder. Tess could almost feel it clawing at her mind, testing her resolve. "Gavin, keep the engines running," Tess ordered. "If we need to make a quick getaway, we'll need all the power we can get." Dr. Ives, start working on disabling the core's transmission. I'll find the blind spots and lead the way. With a deep breath, Tess set her course toward the heart of the station. The ship's interior became colder, the air thicker, as though the station itself was pressing in on them. Tess's eyes darted between the readouts, her hands steady on the controls. "Let's do this," Tess muttered under her breath. Pushing forward into the unknown,